They might be, they might be coming into the church hurting and expecting to be loved and helped and saved and rescued and all those words when they come into the church. And then when they get there and get hurt too, that's like a double whammy type of thing because you weren't expecting that. You expect to be hurt in the world. You don't expect that with the person sitting on the pew next to you, and especially not coming from the pulpit.
And so based on that, we do understand that this hurts the church, but it also hurt persons who are looking to the church. Is that correct? That you would say that it does hurt the outsiders as well?
Absolutely, because think about what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be making disciples and bringing people into the fold. Well, if they're looking from the outside and seeing us infighting and hurting each other, why would they come in? So it's hurting the people looking in, because what we do, even in the church, we go out and we tell our unsaved friends what the church did. So now why would our unsaved friends come into the church if they're going to get hurt there too? So we're both being affected, both inside the church and out.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're actually talking about church hurt. And if you have ever been in a church, you would have heard those words at some point in time. But let's go a little deeper, Mrs. White, because sometimes things happen and we can actually recover from them. How hurtful have these wounds been to persons, in your own opinion, or what you have heard about? And is there any recovery? Is it that this why people are just leaving the church in droves?
Yes, yes, that is one thing that we're seeing. And I think sometimes what we mean to do is to walk away from that church that hurt us. What we end up doing sometimes is walking away from God completely, because we think, well, God let this happen, so does he care about me? So on and so forth. So we mean to walk away from the church and we end up walking away from God, which is even more detrimental than anything that hurt you. But yes, we can recover. And what I would tell people first is I know that people in general are sometimes difficult to deal with, but come back to God first. He wants to heal you. It was never his intent for you to be hurt. We'll deal with the people later, but come back to God first.
Mrs. White, you are touching a point right there, because somebody's hearing and say, you don't understand how much I have hurt. How deep do you think some of these wounds are?
They are very, very deep, because not only does this happen inside of the church, sometimes it's our own family members who are also inside of the church with us. And then sometimes they're complete strangers. They might have become brothers and sisters in Christ. We're Christians, so I can only talk about the Christian faith. I know it happens in other religions as well, but it is very, very deep. And they are wounds, and I think they remain deep wounds because the church gets a little stiff about things like this. We won't talk about it. We pretend like it didn't happen. We try to sweep things under the rug and say, let there be peace. And yes, there should be peace. But what about the person who can't sleep at night because they're wrestling with wanting to be with God and God's people, but God's people aren't accepting, or God's people are hurting them? So the wounds are very deep, especially when we won't address it.
Wow. The chat is open, ladies and gentlemen, for you to go ahead and put those questions or those comments that you need us to address at the end of this program, because this is a topic that is not widely addressed. We have learned of how many hundreds of organizations, religious organizations, let me call it that, that have hurt even kids, and they have swept it under the carpet. Nobody is talking about it. And they say, let sleeping dogs lie. And nobody wants to bring it to the fore, but that's what we're discussing in the room here tonight. Um, Many others would say, Mrs. White, that, we should just adapt the what would Jesus do kind of mentality. It is a church.
Mhm.
And I want to go deep with this one, because we wanna understand, what would Jesus do? We want to learn the what would Jesus do kind of mentality when people expect the church to be a hospital, a place where they go to get well,
Mhm.
to get patched up. But yet they go into the church and they get beaten down, broken down, bruised. Talk to us about that one, the what Jesus would do kind of mentality.
I definitely believe in the what would Jesus do mentality, but I would also ask the church, do you know what Jesus would do? Most of the time, what we mean when we say that is just, oh, let's just forgive and let's just not talk about this. And the time will pass and we will all have dinner and we will sing songs and worship and it will be fine. But the word says, if your brother sins against you, go to him and show him his fault. If he listens, then yes, you have won your brother and all is well. But if he doesn't listen, go and get two more people and come back and try to work it out. If he still doesn't listen, go and get the whole church. Try to work it out. If he still doesn't listen after you have brought the whole church, then you treat him as if he is a pagan or a tax collector. That is what Jesus said. So that is what Jesus would do. That is not what the church typically means when they say, let's do what Jesus would do. I would always ask, show me that in the word, and I'll say, okay, that is exactly what Jesus would do.
This is deep, because how often do we see that happening in any of the churches?
Not often. If it does, it's happening behind closed doors and the people don't actually get to see it.
Okay. And so somebody would argue with you, Mrs. White, that we must exercise wisdom. So we shouldn't let the rest of the congregation know what is happening.
Well, I suppose that there are things that ministry leaders need to talk about in maybe like a business meeting or executive meeting or things that are happening maybe financially with the church or different things like that. But if there is pain, if there is a source of pain and the church is crumbling and we don't let the people know that we're doing something about it, we're going to do something about it, then we're at risk of losing them. And not because we want a bunch of church memberships, like we want 1 million people in the church. We are losing them to the other side, meaning they are walking away from God. And so I agree that yes, there are some things that leadership could talk about behind closed doors, but there are some things that have to be addressed to the congregation and to the people.
I am so enjoying this discussion, because it's bringing so many things to the fore. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have just come into the room, I do see many other persons coming in since we started. We are having this discussion about eradicating church hurt. And we're talking with Mrs. White, Sunny Way White, and she's joining us from the great state of Texas. Texas. And she's qualified to speak on this topic because it's a topic of hurt. And she's a mental health specialist. She's qualified in that area to speak on this. But I want to go back into that point of what would Jesus do? Because many persons view the pastors and the preachers as untouchables, in other words. And so when they do something, it doesn't call for that, but when others do something, then that's the penalty for it. How then would the church come to some kind of conclusion when some persons are exempt and others are not?
That is a huge problem, Dr. Janice, because the leadership should not be exempt. Now, even if you have a counseling ministry or something like that in your church, typically the leadership can't really go to that ministry either because of who they are, the titles and the everything. So they need accountability elsewhere. But there has to be checks and balances and accountability for leadership. They should not be exempt. Like I said earlier, church hurt is multi-directional. So the pulpit can hurt the people, and they do. The pulpit can hurt each other, and they do. But that goes back to what we were also saying earlier, if it's being swept under the rug. That isn't doing anybody any good. The pastor, I don't care how great they are not God. They are the shepherd. They are protecting God's people. If you're not protecting God's people, you're not doing your one job that you're supposed to do as the pastor. So the leadership comes under the pastor. And so it trickles down. If the pastor thinks he or she is exempt and can do whatever they want, then so will the other members of the leadership team. And so we have to stop that somewhere. And training has to be from the top down. No one is exempt.
This is indeed what we need to hear. The example needs to start from the top and flows down. But let's look at the topic one more time, Mrs. White. Let's dig a little deeper into the topic, because the topic says eradicating church hurt. And that word means the complete destruction of something.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this is any at all possible?
I do. And Dr. Janice, this is very psychological for me, the wording that we use and how we go about it. Because when I think of the word fight, we fight a lot. We fight racism, we fight hunger, we fight homelessness. And I think of fighting as being on a battlefield or being in a boxing ring where I'm just getting pulverized. I don't want to fight church hurt. I want to eradicate it. What I see in the spirit is me taking a drone and hovering it over your church and dropping a healing bomb and blowing up the church hurt. So that gives me an idea of strategy. I'm not going to fight. I'm going to eradicate. I don't want to see it anymore.
That is deep and powerful. No more fighting, because as a matter of fact, the church teaches that warfare is an everyday thing, and we understand the logics of it and where it's coming from, and we're not coming against that.
Yes.
But fighting the things that are necessary should be part of this warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things is church hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And so that vision that you have seen is that, yes, it can be eradicated.
Mm-hmm.
But how? Is it who starts? Where does it start? Where does it end? Who get this thing together?
I volunteer as tribute. So it has to start with a person and then catch fire. I know that I'm not the only one doing this. There are other people, other places. We just need to unite. We need to make this thing bigger. It's got to be a movement. Every church, every leadership team, every congregation needs the opportunity to heal and be trained. We need spotters, what I call spotters inside the church, where if I see something going on, there has to be some sort of protocol or strategy where we go and we tackle this thing head on. Yes, I know I said eradicate, and to eradicate, there are small battles. But I don't want to get into that thing of fighting, even though we fight the good fight of faith. I get it, I do. But my strategy, my end result is to eradicate. And there have to be plans and strategies in place. Just like if there was a fire drill in school, you already know what to do, kids. We need this kind of thing in our churches. If we find that there has been hurt in the church, we already know what to do. All we need to do is roll out the plan and address it. No more silence.
That's the word right there. No more silence. Because my next question was going to be, why do you think that so many persons have adopted this mode of silence? They have just gone into this silent mode. They are not saying anything. It's like a deadly silence when there are solutions, strategies.
Mm-hmm. Well, and meaning well in a lot of areas, the church's stance on a lot of things, especially when it comes to mental and emotional issues, is to, oh, just pray about it. Really, that is the biggest blow off to somebody when you tell them to just pray about it. I like to say that just and pray don't even belong in the same sentence, because when you pray, typically God is going to say, okay, now do this. So we need to be able to, I think one of the reasons, again, why we're silent is that people blow us off. They don't understand, or sometimes we don't have the words. We can't figure out how to tell somebody what's going on. So we just stay silent, hoping that they will figure it out, hoping that they will ask the right questions. And sometimes unknowingly, the church requests silence because we don't talk about those types of things. We're getting better in some areas and some churches, depending on how large you are and what kind of resources you have. And that's another thing. If a church is small with no resources and the 80-20 rule is going on, meaning 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work, they're worn out. So they can't handle anything else. So church hurt gets swept under the rug. And what typically happens, like we've already said, is the person just leaves. So in the mind of the members of the church, it's done. They're gone. So we don't have to deal with that. But really, they just took that hurt somewhere else.
And sometimes they come off as being the bad person because they leave.
Yes.
But you said something earlier, because I remember growing up in the church, yes. And we used to have what we call prayer mothers. And they used to position themselves at different places in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And you better be afraid to go into that church if something happened, because one of them is going to, we used to say, pick you up. One of them is going to pick you up. One of them is going to determine that you have a challenge, you have a problem. And they are not going to stop until you expose that problem or that challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody would look back at it and say, but those were the old days. You couldn't use that anymore. In your opinion, do you think that would be something that would be helpful in our day and age, or would it be something that is so outdated it wouldn't work?
It is not outdated. We just ignore it. It's discernment. So if I'm picking, like you said, picking up something on you, and there are certain people that I actually get a feeling, the hair raises on the back of my neck, or something is happening to somebody. If you are allowed by your church or whatever your beliefs are to address that person, to say, hey, you don't even have to say you picked them up. You can say, hey, I'm seeing tears. Are those happy tears or those sad tears? Can I pray for you? Can we step outside? We're not doing that. We have to be intentional about those types of things, because the gift is not dead. We just don't engage it anymore.
Mm. Ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed having one of those conversations at the fireside tonight, talking about church hurt. We are opening so many areas that if we continue on this line, we would be here until maybe tomorrow, but I'm going to hurry along because I need to leave some space for the audience to ask some questions. But I want to come back to this point, Mrs. White, because we talked about the adoption of the deadly silence. We talk about, persons not saying anything. Do you think that some of these things are better left unsaid or undone for the benefit of the majority? Or
Well, Dr. Janice, I am a person who calls things out, and that's not always appreciated, but I would almost venture to say, who is it really better for if we keep silent? Again, the offense or the wound deepens typically around silence. We tend to want to say, oh, time heals all wounds. That is the biggest lie I have ever heard in my entire life. Time does not heal all wounds. So I would say, no, we cannot be silent for the betterment or of the majority, because I would almost venture to say the majority has been hurt, whether they have said it or not, whether they have progressed through it or not. That's a different topic, but I would almost venture to say more people than we actually are aware of have been hurt on any spectrum. It could be from what we would see as the simplest thing to the biggest. So no, I don't think that we can. That sounds like sweeping it under the rug again for me.
ladies and gentlemen, again, we are talking about church hurt. But Mrs. White, can you tell us, list for us, or name a few of what could be considered church hurt? Because many people hear about church hurt and they don't know what really is church hurt. I'm going to give you an example, and then you can tell me if that is church hurt, because I'm going back to church the first time after COVID. And I walked through the door, and there was one of the ushers standing at the door. And I'm not even going to repeat what she said to me, but it was crazy. Like, I expected, I walk into the church after almost a year and a half, maybe a year, and you're going to be at the door and you're going to welcome me back. You're going to be glad to see me coming. But those 6 words that you said, you don't understand how much they core me. And it's because I do understand why I understand.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things that are considered church hurt? Because I would consider that to be a church hurt.
Exactly. So I can't tell you what hurts you. What she said, if she'd said it to me, it may not have hurt me. So I wouldn't say that I had a church hurt, but you did. And that's one thing that we have to be careful of when we're working with people. We blow them off because we don't think the same. But if you said that hurt me, then it was a church hurt. So whatever the 6 words were, that could be church hurt. And anything verbally, we are sometimes very sensitive people. So when we use words, we can hurt people very easily. And so a lot of the times you can't see the hurt because it was verbal, but that person took it in and it's ruminating. It is going around in their minds, and they are traumatizing and re-traumatizing themselves because they're hearing those words. So it could be all the way from something someone says all the way up to a religious trauma, which we haven't talked about because I didn't want to derail the conversation, but it could be all the way up to somebody being sexually assaulted in the church. So if you were hurt in your worship place of worship, it could be considered a church hurt.
Well, you know, I'm going to go a little deeper because I'm going to ask you about that religious trauma right there. Some of the things that you would say fall under the religious trauma. What are some of the things that fall under the religious trauma?
Think about a cult. Also think about what I would call doctrinal terrorism. I made that up. But what I'm talking about is someone using the word of God against you to control you, to hurt you, to dominate you. Those would fall under religious trauma because they've actually used the doctrine to traumatize you, to do something to hurt you under the guise of it being God. So the person walks away or doesn't walk away, they get controlled, they get hurt, thinking that God is saying this, and really he isn't.
That one rings a bell to me, and that rings a big bell to me because I'm coming from where I'm from, my country. They used to do that a lot in the early days. They used to, we call it beat you over your back with the word. They use the word to beat you over your back. And
Yes.
they tell you how much you're going to hell if you don't do this or you don't do that. And
Yes.
sometimes it's not even biblical. And
Yes.
so sometimes I wonder, is it because they lacked the knowledge back then, or that they hurt people so much, people stayed away from the church? And for years, people are afraid to come to church because of some of those things. Would it be
Well, and
lack of knowledge or knowingly?
yes. And I like to say, and I always tell people, know the word for yourself so that you know, or you have a better chance at knowing if that's happening. If you know what the word says, then you'll know when somebody is twisting it. Even if they extract one word, sometimes in certain scriptures, extracting one word out of it completely changes it. And that's what people do. Now, sometimes this is intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. Nevertheless, it has happened. So I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, because somebody made a mistake, then you're not hurt. You still got hurt. It was a mistake, but you still got hurt. So we need to deal with your hurt and we can address the mistake later. But yes, people do beat people over the back or beat people over the head with the word. Some of it might be because they think that that's how you get people to do what they need to do. Some of it is they've gotten power hungry. They've gotten this title or this position or whatever it is, and they are crazy with power. So they're doing it and they're not even in alignment with God. And we have to be careful of that because the word says Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And so his servants can masquerade as servants of righteousness. So you have to be able to tell, is this of God and it's just a little strong? Or is this not of God and this person is drunk with power or whatever is happening?
We could be asking questions for another hour because there are many more questions that we have to ask, but I have to respect time and I have to leave some time for the audience to ask your questions. So I'm going to ask you the final two questions for tonight.
Okay.
Have you ever been in a position where you have felt church hurt? And if yes, how did you deal with it?
I have, And it was really difficult. And it was a situation where I did end up leaving my church. I didn't walk away from God. It wasn't a crisis of faith for me, but it was a crisis in that I could no longer stay in that church. So I physically got away from the situation. It took me a while to regroup and find my place and find where I wanted to be again. But I did, resolve that. And I've also had a friend who suffered the religious trauma, the doctrinal terrorism, and it was years on end. And again, she physically got out first, but carried all the emotional and mental, some physical scars as well. And so it took a really long time because she had to trust everybody again, not just the people in the church, and then trust the church, and then try to trust God, because thinking that God was the one doing this, that's so traumatic within itself. Why would you want to serve a God who you think is a terrorist? So it is really, really tough, but you can recover. You have to be very intentional, and you have to be very careful about who you have in your process, who you find as your counselor, where you go to church, what's your pastor like, what are the people like, but you definitely can recover.
There is recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise you, this conversation is not over. As I listen to Mrs. White speaking, I believe that we need to bring back this conversation another time, and we maybe need to get a panel and hear from others in the church who have battled with this topic for years, and no one is ready to face it. I commend you for being ready to face a topic like this, because it is one that needs to be spoken about.
Absolutely.
In many arenas, so that people can feel more comfortable going into the church, and not just going, staying.
Yes.
Because it's not about just about us. It's about the glory of God.
Yes.
And so we want to make sure that that happens. And before we ask the last question, I am going to go into the audience, because I do believe that they have some questions that they want to ask. I believe I had seen a hand earlier up. And so for this last few minutes, I'm going to just change the my view so